I want to invite you to turn in your Bibles to Numbers chapter 14, long chapter. I couldn't get every verse in the bulletin, so if you have a Bible, I just encourage you to have it there and open to chapter 14. A lot happening in this chapter. There's a lot of blanks. Don't panic. It's not going to be a 45-minute sermon, but there's just a lot to cover and a lot of principles that I think the text highlights that I want to bring to our attention this morning. It's been the last several weeks we've just seen this stress on Moses, this conflict that is continuing after him. Chapter 11, the cloud lifted from the tabernacle, and after 10 months at the base of Mount Sinai, God said, it's time to move. It's time for you to go to Canaan. And so the people got up and they marched, you remember, for 3 days. And then after 3 days, they started complaining again against Moses and Aaron and frankly against God. No meat to eat, and so God provided quail in abundance, if you will recall. The very next chapter, it gets even closer to home as Moses deals with conflict with his siblings, with Miriam and Aaron, who this spirit of competition and rivalry kind of sets in. And he has it again plead for people who don't really have his best interest in mind. Several times you're going to find Moses has to intercede for people who are making his life miserable. What an amazing prayer warrior as he again just goes before God pleading for a people who don't have his best in mind. And he pleads for Miriam. And then chapter 13 we looked at last week, you looked at it with Matt, as spies go out to look at the land of Canaan, and we pick up there. Chapter 14. When we were on vacation this past week, one of the highlights was a fishing trip that Wendy and I took with Logan. We got into a boat and went out into the Gulf of Mexico on just a little 4-hour, not a kind of, you think about Gilligan's Island. It was not a 3-hour tour. It was a 4-hour fishing trip, but you kind of have this. When you see the boat and you see the captain, you're thinking, God, get us back. When we leave, the captain, the owner of the boat, is just emphatic. You will have a great time, and he said on more than one occasion, you will catch fish. You will catch fish. An hour and a half into a 4-hour fishing trip, and not a line has even bent. And I don't want to say anything because I don't want Logan to think that this is a bust. And Wendy said, we talked later, she goes, I wouldn't say anything because I didn't want Logan to be disappointed, but we're praying because this is not a free boat trip, folks. I mean, we didn't blow the budget, but it was not free. And I'm just hearing that man, we will catch fish. And no fish until about an hour and a half, and finally the first catch, and then after that it kind of, we had about 2 hours of good times catching fish. But what I came to discover late in that fishing expedition is that, not surprisingly, I mean it shouldn't have surprised me, but the captain had something at his disposal that helped us with this. He had a sonar device up on the bridge or whatever it is where he's steering the ship. He could see the fish, and just so he knew something I didn't know, and he could see something I couldn't see. And it's occupational hazard, but I'm thinking this will preach. This is God, and I'm not trying to add another metaphor for God, but He is kind of the captain of our ship, isn't He? He can see things we can't see. He knows things we don't know. And so the owner could say with confidence, you will catch fish. And even though that's not the promise to Israel, they had their own promise. Chapter 13, verse 2, basically God, the captain of their ship, is saying, you will have Canaan. It is your land. I'm giving it to you. You will have it. Because I know things you don't know. And I see things you don't see. I'm in charge of this. And it will be yours. But you remember the people, there's this hint of disbelief, this hint of doubt when Matt pointed out to you last week that it was really the people's idea to send spies into the land. God allowed it, but it was the people's idea, and Moses confirmed it and said, all right, go. And he sends those men to check out what God had promised they would have. Now, it would have been like me going out into the Gulf of Mexico with my own little boat and trying to look and say, well, how are we going to catch fish? Because I would not have had what that captain had, the sonar. And those spies go out into the land ill-equipped. They don't see what God sees. They still don't know what God knows. And so when they come back, they say, yes, the land is good, but the people are huge. And the cities are big, and the cities are well fortified. And at that moment, they reach a point, folks, where you and I get multiple times in our lifetime, individually. And I would suggest that this is true sometimes also of churches collectively. We get to this tipping point. And this tipping point is so sharp and so severe that you cannot straddle both sides of it. You have to choose. And the choice is between fear or faith. And after those men come back, that's where they're at. And you've been there. You have faced a certain challenge in your life. A crisis has come up that you have no idea how to respond to it. A test, a trial, and it puts you at the apex of this tipping point. And you can choose fear or you can choose faith. And that's where chapter 13 leaves us. And what will Israel choose? Well, you know the story, but let's read what they choose. Chapter 14, verses 1 through 4. That night, all the people of the community raised their voices and cried out, "We've got the land!" No, they raised their voices and they wept aloud. These are not tears of joy. It's tears of fear. All the Israelites grumbled against Moses and Aaron, and the whole assembly said to them, "If only we had died in Egypt, or even in this desert. Why is Yahweh bringing us to this land only to let us fall by the sword? Our wives and children, they're going to be taken as plunder. Wouldn't it be better for us to go back to Egypt?" And they said to each other, "We should choose a leader, and we should go back to Egypt." Matt mentioned last week that the most often repeated command in the Bible, Genesis to Maps, is fear not. Be not afraid. Do not fear. The most often repeated command all through the Bible. For good reason, isn't it? What's our default button? When we get to this point, what is the first thing that we usually go towards? We start sliding down that fear option, don't we? To me, folks, a sign of Christian maturity is not just the character that gets developed in us. We exceed in love and joy and peace and patience and all the fruit of the Spirit. That's definitely a sign of Christian maturity. But another sign of Christian maturity is that when we face these tipping points in our life, we start more often choosing faith over fear. That's when we become a mature Christian. And you know as well as I that a situation is going to come up in your life. It could be an hour from now, it could be a year from now, but we're going to be there again. 6 years ago, Max Lucado wrote his book, Fearless. Maybe some of you read it, but he wrote it in 2009. He said this at the introduction of the book: "We fear being sued, finishing last, going broke. We fear the mole on the back, the new kid on the block, the sound of the clock as it ticks closer to the grave. So we sophisticate investment plans, we create elaborate security systems, and legislate stronger military, yet we depend on mood-altering drugs more than any generation in history. Fear, it seems, has taken a 100-year lease on the building next door and has set up shop. Oversized and rude, fear is unwilling to share the heart with happiness. Happiness complies and so leaves. Do you ever see the two together? Can you be happy and afraid at the same time? No. Clear thinking and afraid, confident and afraid, merciful and afraid. Fear is the big bully in the high school hallway. Brash, loud, unproductive. For all the noise fear makes and the room it takes, fear does little good. And here we are, 6 years later. It seems like he could revise that book every year, every month, every day. We have Supreme Court rulings. We have crisis in the Middle East. We have economic problems in China and Greece, and somehow that affects us. And as I'm talking, you can just, it's the fear monitor, maybe even going up as I speak. Now, it's important, when we get to this tipping point, we can fool ourselves. We can deceive ourselves. We can say, well, I'm not choosing fear. I'm being reasonable. I'm being realistic. I'm being cautious. But you know what? It's fear. It's fear. So let's look at how fear what's the anatomy of this fear in this response of Israel. Their response, folks, is our response. Their situation is different than ours, but it's the same dynamic at work. There are several things at work here in this anatomy of fear. The first level is that fear always sees disaster more than blessing. You've been there. Fear always sees disaster more than blessing. Why did God lead us to this place only to let us fall by the sword? Our wives and our children will be taken as plunder. Does that sound like what God said in chapter 13, verse 2? Enter the land of Canaan, which I am giving to the Israelites. Look, turn back also to chapter 13. When Moses gives the instruction to the 12 spies, look at verses 17 through 20 with me. He sent them to explore the land of Canaan. He said, go up through the Negev and on into the hill country. See what the land is like, whether the people who live there are strong or weak, few or many. What kind of land do they live in? Is it good or bad? What kind of towns do they live in? Are they unwalled or fortified? How is the soil? Is it fertile or is it poor? Are there trees on it or not? Do your best to bring back some fruit of the land. Where in that did Moses ever say, and come back and give us your opinion on whether or not we can take it? Fear always goes to worst case scenarios, doesn't it? If you're like me, you've found that quiet moment. Maybe it's lying in bed, a conflict, a crisis is in front of you, and you begin to let your mind go. You done this? Am I the only one? And it never comes out well, does it? You can just begin to think of all the bad things that are going to happen. And you paint always a worst case scenario. And there are times I've done this and I've gotten myself into such a state of anxiety. I finally have to realize, Ty, none of this has happened. You're imagining this. My fears have taken over my faith. Because fear sees disaster. When the apostles or the disciples are in the boat on the stormy mega storm, as Mark calls it in Mark chapter 4, remember what they said to Jesus? Don't you care if we drown? They are convinced it's going to be the end. We always go there. Fear takes us there. It doesn't see the potential blessing. It doesn't see opportunities. It only sees disaster. The second level of fear is that it chooses retreat over advancement. It would be better for us, they say, to go back to Egypt. Let's choose a leader. Let's go back to Egypt. Fear always chooses retreat. Let's hunker down. Let's just find a place, a quiet place. Let's get away from it all and retreat. And maybe all this will pass over. We'd rather go back to Egypt. Let me refresh your memory. Before God called Moses at the burning bush to lead the people of Israel out of Egypt, this is what was going on. Exodus chapter 2, verse 23. During that long period, the king of Egypt died, and the Israelites groaned in their slavery, and they cried out. And their cry for help was because of their slavery, and it went up to God. God heard their groaning, and he remembered his covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So God looked on the Israelites and was concerned about them. Does that sound like something you want to return to? We said at the very beginning of this that getting Israel out of Egypt was easy for God. Getting Egypt out of Israel was going to be the real challenge. Forgiving our sin, that's God's specialty. Getting us to hate our sin, to turn our back on sin, that's the lifelong process, isn't it? And so when we get to this tipping point and we start to slide down fear, we see the worst case scenarios, we see disaster more than the potential blessing on the other side. And we're tempted, folks, to retreat. And I've known individuals, and frankly, I've seen churches choose retreat. The world's too dark. The challenge is too great. The cost is too high. We'll just hunker away, and we'll be a nice little community. And it's a decision based on fear, because there's no sense of faith and advancement. The third level of fear is that we choose rebellion instead of submission. Maybe you could also, I thought about this one for most of the week. Maybe this is precisely what's happening here. Maybe for us, the better application is that we tend to choose blame over responsibility. See, I think there's a sense of blaming going on here. Certainly with Moses and Aaron. They grumble and complain against Moses and Aaron again. But they're also kind of blaming God. Why is Yahweh leading us to this place only to let us fall by the sword? There's a sense in which they're also blaming God for their crisis. Fear creates in us a spiritual amnesia, doesn't it? When fear takes over, we forget all the good things about God. When fear shapes our response, safety becomes our God. When fear shapes our response at that tipping point, safety becomes our God. And when safety becomes our God, what we worship is a risk-free life. And so we will reject anything that pushes us towards advancement, whether that's a leader or whether it's God. Let's choose another leader, they said. Funny thing, we want leaders. If you ask what are the qualities you want of a leader, we usually say we want a leader to inspire us, to challenge us, to lead us forward. But when that leader does that and we get frightened, we want a leader who will do what we want them to do, which is really no leadership at all. Moses had more than enough credibility with these people. He had faced Pharaoh. He had climbed the mountain, been face to face with God. He had the radiance of God's glory on his face, but fear overshadowed all of their remembering of that. Remember, complaints turn into campaigns, and campaigns always lead to conflict. Third level of fear, worst of all, it actually stands in opposition to faith. So after Caleb and Joshua get up and talk to the crowd, and we're going to get to that in just a little bit, when they actually address the crowd and present the side of faith, look at verse 10. The whole assembly talked about stoning them. Let's kill the people of faith. Fear, once it gets so far advanced, actually stands in complete opposition to faith, and faith is actually seen as the enemy. That's how bad fear gets in our hearts. If safety is the God of the fearful, then faith is the enemy. And so with the disciples in the boat on that stormy sea, Jesus puts it accurately. Mark 4, verse 40. Why are you so afraid? Do you still have no faith? Because the two are diametrically opposed. You can't live in fear and faith at the same time. When was the last time you were at that tipping point? When was the last time you were faced with such a situation, whether it was a world event or a personal crisis, that you had to make the choice between fear and faith? The choice of fear is not a pretty one, is it? But against this are four courageous men, Moses, Aaron, Joshua, and Caleb. And they are the epitome of faith. And so their testimony is worth imitating. And by the way, before we look at their example, keep in mind, folks, keep in mind, faith will not disappear. The story of God and the story of His work with His people, again, Genesis to Revelation, He always has a faithful remnant. Elijah, you are not alone. There are 7,000 who have not bowed down to Baal. Nehemiah was not alone. Ezra was not alone. Daniel was not alone. Even in captivity, they were not alone. God holds a remnant of faithful. So what does faith look like? Verse 5, Moses and Aaron fell face down in front of the whole Israelite assembly gathered there. Joshua, son of Nun, and Caleb, son of Jephunneh, who were among those who had explored the land, tore their clothes. Faith is grieved by disbelief. They fell face down. They ripped their clothes as a sign of grief. You may treat disbelief carefully, even lovingly, and patiently, but you don't treat disbelief casually. Their response was not a casual response. They respond in faith with the same amount of passion that the people fall into on the side of fear. And so when the people of faith see disbelief, they're grieved by it, by that disbelief. But then secondly, they are then bold among those disbelievers. So Joshua and Caleb, verse 7, said to the entire Israelite assembly, they get up, the two of them, in front of millions. The land we passed through and explored is exceedingly good. If the Lord is pleased with us, He will lead us into that land, a land flowing with milk and honey, and He will give it to us. Picture these two in your mind, against all the wailing, against all the crying, against all the fear, against the threats of rebellion. Listen to them. Do not rebel against the Lord. Do not be afraid of the people of the land, because we will swallow them up. Their protection is gone, but the Lord is with us. Do not be afraid of them. Is there a better word for the church today than that? I don't care what the Supreme Court says. I don't care what the president says. I don't care what the economy is. This is the word for the church today. Their protection is gone. The Lord is with us. Faith is always bold among disbelievers. It is time for us to be bold, not choose the path of fear. This is David versus Goliath courage, folks. This is Jesus in front of the Pharisees kind of boldness. The third testimony of faith is that it is certain of God's presence. The Lord is with us. This is what separates Joshua and Caleb from the rest of the assembly. Folks, they they saw what everyone else in Israel saw. They saw the cloud hovering over the tabernacle. Despite the sin of the golden calf, God said, my presence will not leave you. And so after the tabernacle's made, his presence in a cloud by day with a pillar of fire in that cloud at night, letting the people know, I am here. Everyone saw it. Joshua, Caleb, all the other spies, all the other people, they all saw it, but Joshua and Caleb saw it with the eyes of faith. This is what separated them, not their speaking skills, not their personalities, their belief in the presence of God among them. Chapter 14, look at verse 24. God says about Caleb, he has a different spirit. He sees what other people see, but he sees it differently. He sees with the eyes of faith. God is with us. He's not abandoning us. He is leading us. Faith is certain of God's presence. And so even though you're at this tipping point and you can't see what's ahead, faith says, I don't know what's ahead. I just know that God is with me. And as a parent, you know what that means to your child. When a child is afraid of something, with you by them, holding them, caring for them, taking their hand, they'll do things that they won't do on their own, whether it's jump in a pool or enter a dark room. As long as their parent is holding them, as long as the presence of a father or mother is with them, a child will overcome their fears. This is what the people of faith know. My God is with me. He has not abandoned us. He is leading us. He is taking us into his arms. And fourthly, the testimony of faith is that it is consumed with God's glory. Consumed with the glory of God. The overarching desire and thought and care and concern of the faithful is that God be glorified, be praised, be honored, be revered, be respected, be held up. And so, after the fearful see faith as the enemy and want to stone Caleb and Joshua for challenging the people and for telling them that the presence of God is with them, God said, that's enough. Enough. Moses, I'm going to destroy these people. I'm going to start over with you. It's the second time he said this to Moses. Remember? At the golden calf. And now here again, their blatant fear and disbelief, God says, enough. I'm going to destroy them right here. I'm going to give them what they think is going to happen. Verse 13, Moses says to the Lord, then the Egyptians will hear about it. By your power you brought these people up from among them, and they will tell the inhabitants of this land about it. They've already heard that you, Yahweh, are with these people, and that you, Yahweh, have been seen face to face, that your cloud stays over them, that you go before them in a pillar of cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night. If you put these people to death all at one time, the nations who have heard this report will say, the Lord, Yahweh, was not able to bring these people into the land he promised them on oath. And so he just slaughtered them in the desert. So now may the Lord's strength be displayed. Just as you have declared, the Lord is slow to anger, abounding in love, forgiving sin and rebellion, yet he does not leave the guilty unpunished. He punishes the children for the sin of their fathers to the third and fourth generation. In accordance with your great love, forgive the sin of these people, just as you have pardoned them from the time they left Egypt until now. Again, Moses interceding for people who have made his life miserable. Now, there's something else you need to know about this. What we just read is the summary of 40 days of intercession. Now, if you know the story, you know that this generation is going to die off. We're going to get there just a little bit. And so in Deuteronomy, Moses retells a lot of the story to the younger generation. And we read this in Deuteronomy chapter 10, verses 10 and 11. Now I had stayed on the mountain 40 days and nights as I did the first time. So when they made the golden calf and Moses intercedes for them, it was a 40-day and night intercession. And when they respond with fear and want to go back to Egypt, he intercedes with a 40-day and 40-night intercession for these people. And the Lord listened to me at this time also. It was not his will to destroy you. Go, the Lord said to me, and lead the people on their way so they may enter and possess the land I swore to their fathers to give them. And in that 40 days and 40 nights, Moses can only think of the character of God, the honor of God. God, I cannot let your name be dragged through the mud. It won't look good in the papers if you kill us all right here in the desert. Don't start over with me. Moses would not allow anyone to think more of him if it meant that they think less of God. That's amazing faith. I would not have anyone think any more of me, God, if it means that they think less of you. The people of faith this is what it means being consumed with the glory of God. The overarching concern is God's name, his honor, his praise. So he asked God to forgive the people. Verse 20, the Lord replied, I have forgiven them, as you asked. Now, nevertheless, as surely as I live, and as surely as the glory of the Lord fills the whole earth, not one of the men who saw my glory and the miraculous signs I performed in Egypt and in the desert, but who disobeyed me and tested me 10 times, not one of them will ever see the land I promised on oath to their forefathers. No one who has treated me with contempt will ever see it. But because my servant Caleb has a different spirit and follows me wholeheartedly, I will bring him into the land he went to, and his descendants will inherit it. Since the Amalekites and Canaanites are living in the valleys, turn back tomorrow, set out toward the desert along the route to the Red Sea. Had to be some of the hardest words Moses ever heard. You groomed me in Midian as I tended sheep. You called me in the burning bush. You had me face Pharaoh. You opened the Red Sea. You met with me on Mount Sinai. You gave us your word. You have been leading me in this promise of getting to Canaan. And now we have to turn back because of fear, because of disbelief. We have to turn back because a generation has to die in this desert before we can enter into Canaan. The Lord said to Moses and Aaron, verse 26, how long will this wicked community grumble against me? I've heard the complaints of these grumbling Israelites, so tell them, as surely as I live, declares the Lord, I will do to you the very things I heard you say. So in the desert your bodies will fall. You thought you were going to die in Canaan? No, you're going to die here. Every one of you 20 years old or more who was counted in the census and who has grumbled against me. Not one of you will enter the land I swore with uplifted hand to make your home, except Caleb son of Jephunneh and Joshua son of Nun. As for your children that you said would be taken as plunder, I will bring them in to enjoy the land you have rejected. But your bodies will fall in this desert. Your children will be shepherds here for 40 years, suffering for your unfaithfulness, until the last of your bodies lies in the desert. For 40 years, 1 year for each of the 40 days you explored the land, you will suffer for your sins. You will know it is like what it is like to have me against you. Verse 36. So the men Moses had sent to explore the land, who returned and made the whole community grumble against them by spreading a bad report about it. These men responsible for spreading the bad report about the land were struck down, died of a plague right before Yahweh. Of the men who went to explore the land, only Joshua and Caleb survived. The tragedy of fear is not just that it ultimately leads to God's discipline. The tragedy of fear is that it so clouds our thinking that we get things completely turned around. Israel feared every inhabitant of Canaan. They don't trust the captain of their ship, who knows what they don't know and who sees what they don't see. And what they don't know and what they don't see and what they don't trust is that the people of Canaan are 10 times more afraid of the people of Israel. We know this from Joshua when he finally crosses the land and sends some spies to the first big city that they're going to encounter, which is Jericho. And some spies go to a woman's house named Rahab and listen to what she says to them in Joshua chapter 2, verses 8 through 11. Before the spies lay down for the night, she went up on the roof and said to them, I know that the Lord has given this land to you, and that a great fear of you has fallen on us, so that all who live in this country are melting in fear because of you. We've heard how the Lord dried up the water of the Red Sea for you when you came out of Egypt, and what you did to Sihon and Og, the 2 kings of the Amorites, east of the Jordan, whom you completely destroyed. And when we heard of it, our hearts melted, and everyone's courage failed because of you. For Yahweh, your God, is God in heaven above and on earth below. They're more afraid of Israel. But Israel doesn't know this because they don't trust God. They're not walking in faith, they're walking in fear. This is the tragedy. This is the tragedy of fear. So the 10 spies die. They're gone. Verse 39. We got to go quick. There's just so much happening here. But it's disbelief. What happens from this point forward, don't mistake as faith. It's disbelief, because it is just as much disbelief to think you can do something without God as not doing something God says He's in. I hope that made some kind of sense. Verse 39, when Moses reported this to all the Israelites, they mourned bitterly. Early the next morning, they went up toward the hill country. We have sinned, they said. We will go up to the place the Lord has promised. They have regret. No repentance. Just a lot of regret. But Moses said, why are you disobeying the Lord's command? This is not going to succeed. I've told you, God said you're going to die in the desert. It's not for you. Do not go up, because the Lord is not with you. You will be defeated by your enemies. The Amalekites, the Canaanites will face you there. Because you have turned away from Yahweh, He will not be with you. You will fall by the sword. Nevertheless, in their presumption, they went up toward the high hill country, though neither Moses nor the ark of the Lord's covenant moved from the camp. They come to the Amalekites and Canaanites who live in the hill country. They're attacked, and they beat them all the way down to Hormah. It's just as much disbelief to think we can do something without God as when God says, this is what I want you to do, and we don't do it. It's disbelief. So let's just quickly end here with 3 more life lessons. The first of which is, no amount of sorrow can undo the consequences of sin. God will not be mocked. We reap what we sow. Have you ever known someone who thinks getting a little bit of religion is going to give them immunity from all the hard things in life? If I turn to God, then I won't have to face the consequences of all my bad decisions in the past. No. We reap what we sow. The psalmist put it this way in Psalm 99, verse 8, O Lord our God, you answered them. You were to Israel a forgiving God, though you punished their misdeeds. This is just as much a part of God's glory as His love. The Lord is slow to anger, abounding in love, forgiving sin and rebellion. Yet He does not leave the guilty unpunished. Same part of God's character. No amount of sorrow can eliminate the effects of our sin. Second life lesson, no amount of effort can claim a promise granted by faith. So, in other words, you cannot try to do the right thing in the wrong way. Disbelieving when God is with you is the same as trying to do things when God isn't with you. And so Abraham is given a promise that he's going to be the father of a nation, of nations, as many as, and so he tries, because of his impatience to do the right thing in the wrong way. And he takes his handservant, Hagar, and I'll have a son through you, Ishmael. That was not the child of promise. And conflict ever since, because you cannot put effort into claiming something that's granted by faith. Folks, by the way, this is the salvation story too, right? None of us can go up to God and say, I've earned this. None of us has done anything that God's going to look at and say, you know what? You are good enough. You don't need my promise. If it's true in the gospel, it's true in the rest of life that no amount of effort can claim a promise granted by faith. And finally, number 3, no amount of unbelief can keep God from accomplishing his purposes. God has another generation ready. Now, remember, lesson 2. Don't think that the next generation accomplished the promise of land by their good behavior. They didn't do so well either. One of Paul's sermons in a synagogue in Acts chapter 13, verse 18 says that God endured their conduct for about 40 years in the desert. The next generation was just as rotten as the previous. No amount of unbelief can keep God from accomplishing his purposes. We're out of time, but one of my best friends grew up in the Oak Cliff neighborhood of Dallas, Texas. And in his growing up years, the face of that community began to change. And the ethnicity of the neighborhoods began to change. And his church and most of the other churches around them refused to act out in faith and to reach out to their new neighbors. They retreated in fear and tried to hunker down and try to maintain their whatever they were trying to maintain. And not one of those churches, not my friend's church he grew up in, or any that he knew about that retreated in fear, remains to this day. See, a man came in about 10 years later named Tony Evans. And he started a church because God will be true to his purpose. And no amount of unbelief will thwart him from that. Folks, the greatest opportunities we have as a church lie ahead of us. And almost daily, we're at a tipping point. And we can choose fear or we can walk in faith. Let's pray. You, O God, are a great God, abounding in love, full of grace and mercy, anxious to forgive. At the same time, God, you do not hold the guilty unpunished. We will reap what we sow. My prayer this morning, God, is that as a church, for every individual facing what they're facing in their life, as a church, what we face in our life, God, I pray that we would respond in faith, that the voice of faith, that the passion of faith would win over fear. Because we trust, God, that you see what we can't and that you know what we don't. Give us the courage that we need. And we pray it in Jesus' name.